Good afternoon. I think we have most people have joined already, so we'll get started. Welcome to Accelirate's Process Approval Workflow Workshop. We'll be reviewing different approaches and different levels of approvals that you can add to your RPA discovery, design, development, and support processes. My name is Roger Hernandez. I'm a Client Engagement Director, and joining me is Hossein. Hossein, please introduce yourself.
My name is Hossein Ziayan. I'm a Senior Engagement Manager on Accelirate.
Okay, so with that introduction, let's get started. This slide, most of you are familiar with, but it gives a very, very high-level overview of the process automation lifecycle in an RPA department or COE, from definition to implementation to maintenance. And on the right-hand side, there's a maturity or growth path for an RPA program, from a very small initial engagement all the way to a fully mature COE, whether that's centralized or federated, it doesn't matter. A lot of the same approaches apply. So again, just an overview, but it talks about the major areas in the discovery analysis and implementation support, implementation, user acceptance tests and hypercare, and then incidents, reports and dashboards, and ongoing process enhancements. Now, in the definition side, there aren't as many approval steps that and approval gates that apply as would in the implementation and support side, but there are still some. For a small team, really the only approval step there is which processes get selected for that initial engagement or for the wave-to-wave engagements that are picked to be implemented by the 2 or 3 developers that you have in your team. So a normal flow would be a business analyst does discovery, generates a list of candidates. The RPA project lead or potentially the business lead selects which processes to implement. And the approval step is the business area owner saying, yes, I agree with those, or no, I like to change this for something else. As your team grows, there's a little bit more involved approval process because the actual process and business metrics being used are also approved. They need an approval step. And as you're doing a large-scale discovery, you're potentially doing departmental or cross-departmental flows, and those also need to be approved by the appropriate level of the business. On the process analysis side, this is once you've selected your candidates, you start creating your PDDs. The PDD, the process definition document, that PDD needs to be reviewed and approved before it can go into implementation. And that's regardless of whether you're a small or a full-size team. As your team grows, then once the PDD gets created, the ROI gets reevaluated. The initial ROI that gets generated during discovery, it's a very rough estimate because you don't know the low-level details of the process. Once your analysts have built their PDD, you have those low-level details, and you can do a more accurate evaluation. So as your team matures, that's a step that comes in to reevaluate that ROI and implementation feasibility and to have that approval to move forward by the business area owners and architect. And finally, depending on your industry, this might or might not apply, but in a lot of industries, there's compliance and operational risks assessments that need to take place. It could be something like HIPAA, it could be financial regulations, it could be the process itself communicates with external parties, so there's a lot of risk of potential bad information or crossing of the wires where information from one customer gets sent to a different customer. So that kind of process, that kind of risk mitigation evaluation happens through all the stages of the development, but it starts at the PDD. Then we move on to the actual implementation, testing, and hypercare of the process. And this is more like a traditional software development flow. There's a ton of gates and a ton of approvals that could happen, and it really depends on how complex your development flow is. Again, when you're starting out, a lot of these things don't apply. As you grow, then you start adding some of these gates and checks to comply with your organizational requirements. But implementation, a small team really just looks at as the solution design document. The SCD is reviewed and approved by the business area owner and by your architect. As your team grows and the level of checks needs to grow, then the RP architect and developers are really looking not just at the process implementation, but also does the general architecture meet the architectural requirements and guidelines? And once again, your compliance and risk mitigation teams get involved to make sure that you're in compliance and that you've properly addressed operational risks. Finally, once you have a mature RPA team and COE, some of the things you can consider are, is your process properly accounting for your logging and time tracking? What this means is, once the process gets in support, do you have sufficient logging to be able to understand the behavior of the process, and if there's a failure, how it failed? And two, do you have enough time tracking activities or logging to be able to properly measure the behavior of the process and the time savings, the ROI of the process? It becomes really important, especially with high volume transactional processes. I estimated X $100,000 savings per month. Am I actually seeing that savings? And this is how you measure it. And then one additional consideration as you scale to hundreds of processes is the approach I'm using, the architectural approach I'm using, does it match the approach that we want to use for the appropriate license utilization? For very large volume critical processes, it doesn't really matter. The ROI is so large that it doesn't matter how many licenses you use, you will always get a strong ROI. For some processes that are more infrequent, maybe you want to use an architectural approach where the license utilization matches the ROI of that process. Moving forward to user acceptance testing, there's similar kind of checkpoints, but really initially it's just, do you have a UAT and is it properly designed to test the process? At the next level, you're looking at doing a review of the UAT plan by the business owners, but also not just the results, but also before the UAT plan gets run, an in-depth analysis to make sure that all the business scenarios, even unlikely scenarios, are being tested by the UAT test plan. So in some organizations, the business users or developers themselves run the UAT, but in a lot of places it's a separate team. So those results are evaluated after that team runs the deployment. Finally, once the UAT results are done, production deployment. That typically is approved by a business area owner, and what ends up happening is as you grow in maturity, that becomes its own approval step. Just because UAT is finished successfully does not mean the business is ready for this process to be turned on. It's possible there's a period of time that needs to be done to migrate the manual activities to get ready for the bot to run, or it's possible they're in the middle of a quarterly closing, so they don't have the time available to monitor the bot as it gets turned on. So this approval step, it's its own gate or its own checkpoint. And additional things that get evaluated here are RPA and enterprise infrastructure requirements. Do I have licenses for the VDI? Do I have enough VDIs? Am I allowed to give access to the bot to all these user roles? Are the applications, do I have enough licenses and user accounts for these applications for these bots? Do I have platform licenses for the bot? And finally, again, once you reach that last level of maturity, you're looking at potentially with automated tools measuring the test code coverage. Did my UAT fully cover all the paths in the code in my bot? And that's something that's approved and evaluated by the RP architect. Once a process is in production, typically there's a period where the development team keeps monitoring and supporting the bot, maybe alongside support, and that's called hypercare. In this place, the process promotion from hypercare into support, that's your first approval checkpoint, where the business area owner accepts that hypercare has succeeded, the hypercare period has finished and succeeded, and it's moving into long-term support. As your team grows, some of the things that, some of the approval checks that you add are reviewing and signing off on the hypercare plan and the sign-off criteria. For different bots, it might be very different. If you have a high volume transactional bot, maybe what you're looking at is number of transactions processed successfully and the percentage. More than 1,000 transactions processed successfully, more than 90% successful. If you have something that runs weekly or monthly, maybe you're looking at 3 full cycles with no errors. If you have something that runs, it's high importance, but only runs quarterly, then maybe you want to plan out your hypercare deployment so that it spans that end of quarter and your criteria is 1 successful quarterly processing. So it'll vary very differently, and this needs to be evaluated and signed off by the business. And finally, in your mature RPA COE teams and COEs, the handoff itself, so the support team needs to be ready to and understand enough about the bot that they can support it and they can manage the day-to-day. So one of the things that needs to happen is the support team lead needs to have sufficient knowledge transfer, sufficient documentation, and needs to sign off on the acceptance of the bot into long-term support. In maintenance, Hossein, do you want to review this section?
So in the maintenance, when there is any issue, we open a ticket. Usually they have a ticketing system, depend on the company, how big they are. So there are some process when you open a ticket, and it will go to the approval for fixing that the ticket, and there should be limited UAT running to measure that it's this actually running the successful scenarios that as before, and also fixing the bug that is there. So there is a UAT sign off and approval that it will go to the production. As we grow, so maybe in the architecture and other need to review if there is a architectural change in to fixing the bug, and so they need to approval and see it's a match with the organizational architecture. So as we also grow more to very mature, so the support team, they may take this box and for the different reason. One of the reason may be stability or scaling. So they made some changes to it. That need to be approved by the business owner and architecture. And also there is a case that maybe supporting because of the efficiency or other changes that maybe third-party application doing, refactoring the process. This also need to be go through the same approval by architecture and architect and business owner, and also approved by the compliance risk mitigation. For enhancement, this part is happening. The first part is happening with the support team, but for enhancement, usually they return it to the development team, depend on the size of the team and the COE. So for enhancement, the business, they need to approve it, and also architect if they're growing. So, and if there are architectural change, they need to be reviewed by the compliance risk mitigation team. I think I cover all this.
Sure. So
yeah.
some additional areas, again, and this is an enhancement, and as Hossein mentioned, depending on your organization, enhancements might be part of the development team responsibilities, But a lot of times, especially as the size of the team grows, the support team itself not only does incident management, but they also do ongoing updates and enhancements to the process automations. So in those scenarios, one of the things that the enhancement track considers is potential re-architecture, license optimizations or changes, and platform upgrades. You have a major upgrade of your platform. That's a significant effort that needs to do that might lead to potential process enhancements, either to account for changes in the behavior or more likely to account for new features in the platform that allow you to simplify your bot architecture or make it more resilient. For example, you're moving from a polling approach to a queue triggering approach to increase response time and resiliency. So in those scenarios, your business area owner approves the process upgrades, your RPA architect and developers review and approve the enhancement architecture and code. And once again, similar to the other changes, your compliance and risk mitigation team have an approval step to ensure you're in compliance and you've addressed production risks. So how do you measure? What tools and processes do you use? And I put at the bottom, but the first thing I'm going to say is seriously considering adopting the tools and processes already used in your organization. Typically, your IT and software development department have these workflows because they all deal with software development lifecycle workflows that have all these approval steps or very similar approval steps built into them. If you adopt those tools, you won't be reinventing the wheel, and it'll be easier for you to get support from those organizations. However, in some organizations, you might not have those tools available, or they might be configured and set up in a way that's very different than the way you need them. In that case, you would consider other approaches. Now, easiest way to start is spreadsheet tracking and emails. Everybody has them, and it's very easy to get started. Just create a spreadsheet with your state for each process, your states, your step names, when the approval was requested, when it was approved, who approved it. Keep track of your emails as approval, and use that as a tracking mechanism. Very easy to get started. It does not scale well when you have hundreds of processes. So as you grow, you start to consider some tools, and in this part, it's very hard to make a perfect recommendation. Every tool is different, and it depends what kind of skill sets you have in your organization. But some of the tools to look at is you could do a custom workflow management solution. I've seen them built with Salesforce, with Power Automate, Trello, Jira, ServiceNow. They all have, to some extent, customizable workflow capabilities. Other tools to look at on the CI/CD, the automated build and deployment, is integrating Azure DevOps, or for example, or GitLab with your workflow management solution. And finally, sometimes your issue management system and workflow is separate than your discovery, analysis, and development workflow. So potentially there's an integration point between the tools, but some of the systems out there that do this are ServiceNow, Remedy, and sometimes Jira is also used for this. And the other thing you want to do is, if at all possible, is automate your build and potentially your deployment pipeline with your approval workflow. If you have a manual build and deployment step, that's a chance for inconsistencies or errors to come in. Anytime you have something with a lot of complex moving pieces that needs to be done manually, that's a good area to address with automation. So we strongly recommend, once you implement some of these workflow tools, to integrate your build as part of that process. And once again, if IT has it, that's your first choice. Any questions?
All right, there's a couple questions, Roger.
Sure.
All right. The first one. Do we need approval for RAP infrastructure setup?
It's gonna depend. Yes, yeah. I mean, at a minimum, you need IT involved, right? And they're going to need to work with you to provide you either with the infrastructure, or if you're doing hosted infrastructure, to provide you with some level of support and monitoring of that infrastructure. Now, if you have a mature RPA COE organization, maybe you can handle that internally. In which case, really all you need is budgetary approval. But in most organizations, at least at the beginning, you're going to need to involve, IT, security, and support to get their buy-in to host and manage this infrastructure.
Okay, there's another one.
Okay.
What is the approval process for bot AD account and application access?
Sure. So that's so essentially, bot has a lot of requirements, and not just those. It's also the BDI. It's also if you have application licenses like SAP or other applications that have their own licensing limits. Normally, you would need to involve, in the case of AD, your IT or infrastructure teams, and you would need to involve your application management or maintenance teams for some of the larger standalone applications, and get their approval for you to create these new accounts. So if that's the case in your organization, if you have those tools or applications, you need to add those steps when deploying new bots.
Okay, let me see. That's actually the last question.
Okay. Well, if no other questions, what we'll do is we'll make this presentation available. And if anyone has any questions, please don't hesitate to email us at any time, and we'll answer those as soon as we get them. Have a good afternoon, and thank you.